Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse. Today is Wednesday, October 22nd, 2025. It is 11 a.m. in Eastern Time at the time of this recording. My name is Sebastian Parra. I'm here with my co-host Josiah. Josiah, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Sebastian.
Well, this is a very different side of our podcasting world. It's been roughly 10 days since the release of all living hostages from the Gaza Strip. Thank God for that. If you haven't watched that episode, we released that last week, I think last Monday. So go take a look at that. We went through every hostage, their names, a little bit of their stories, show pictures. It's just a joyful episode. But of course, the phase 2 of Trump's plan to end the war in Gaza has not officially begun because Hamas is still holding several dead hostages in violation of phase 1 agreement. Remember, the deal was supposed to be that all living and dead hostages will be released within 72 hours of the agreement being signed, but it seems like Hamas is dragging their feet. Meanwhile, Hamas is trying to protect their power in the Gaza Strip, and it is easy for things in Gaza to fly under the radar right now. Today, we're going to discuss whether this matters. Also this week, Jared Kushner, I guess special advisor to the president, and Steve Witkoff, a hostage negotiator, and also Vice President Vance is in Israel right now. We'll be following those events closely. It just shows how much this stuff matters to the administration. I also heard, Josiah, that Marco Rubio might be going there this week. So it's just really Trump is putting a lot of energy. He put his name, his signature, his reputation behind this deal. So, Josiah, before we go any farther, let's talk about Hamas. Why are they seemingly violating the terms of the deal? Do you think they have violated these deals, as some have said, or is it true that they just can't find the dead hostages? Why are they still holding to them?
Yeah, it's a good question. So this issue of the dead bodies of hostages is critical for a couple of reasons. One, because it does represent a violation of the agreement. They were supposed to be released on the same day as the live hostages, which would have been last Monday, so about 10 days ago now. And of course, as you just referenced or alluded to, the administration, the different mediators and negotiators who helped reach that agreement all have a serious vested interest in seeing the deal continue to move forward to hold, not only for the ceasefire to hold, but to advance to phase 2, the sort of post-war plans for Gaza. And it's very difficult for that to happen if the agreement has not been implemented properly up until this point, or phase 1 of the agreement. There are, of course, a lot of excuses, which again, you sort of alluded to in terms of why Hamas might be making these excuses. I think there's a couple of reasons, but I just want to highlight, first of all, the reason why I believe that they are excuses and not valid reasons for inability to provide the bodies. A couple of things. One, they're arguing things like we don't have the equipment necessary to find the bodies, but there's already been equipment transferred into the Gaza Strip to help in these efforts. Turkey actually sent something like 80 search and rescue experts into the Gaza Strip in order to facilitate or help with the process of doing the recovery operations to find and return these bodies as well. So I don't think this is really about a lack of resources available to Hamas to find these bodies or recover these bodies. You also have many reports coming out challenging their claim that they not only are having trouble recovering, but having trouble locating the bodies. But you have living hostages coming out of Gaza saying things like, I was held with dead bodies. They know where these dead bodies are. Like it's clear to me and clear to Hamas where at least some of these bodies are. They're lying about not being able to locate or find them. So you do have to, I think, sort of challenge whether or not these excuses have any validity or not. Last thing I'll say on that point is that Hamas now has a pretty clear habit of saying we won't be able to release a body because we can't find it. And then within 24 hours, someone puts pressure on Hamas and Hamas miraculously finds another body to deliver to the IDF and return to Israel. So, they're stalling. It's pretty obvious that if they wanted to, if they were motivated to, they could return the dead bodies much faster. I'm not saying that they have access to every single one of the bodies, but it's pretty clear that they could be moving a lot faster through this process if they really wanted to. Now, in terms of why they're slowing down or stalling the process, I think it's just to buy time, frankly. They don't have a lot of leverage left to work with because you have the mediators, you have the White House, for example, saying things like Hamas has to give back these bodies. They've already been given everything that they are due at this point in the process of the agreement. There's nothing more that they're going to get by keeping these dead bodies, so they need to give them back if they want the deal to keep moving forward. I think my personal opinion right now is that Hamas doesn't necessarily want the deal to move forward because phase two of the plan isn't actually very good for Hamas. They're stalling for time, trying to change conditions on the ground and sort of create a new status quo that benefits them more than phase two of the Trump plan would. And that probably is why you're seeing them slow the release of the bodies in accordance with phase one so that they can buy time before anyone actually begins serious discussions about phase two.
I was dreaming up this scenario in my head. I wonder what you think of it. Let's say there was a family that was holding a hostage or a dead body. They know where they were. And then those people died and they were the only one who knew where they were. And then maybe that place, that building was collapsed during an airstrike or something. And there truly is no way to get to them. That's what I mean, I hate to put myself in the position to be the devil's advocate for Hamas, but could this be possible? Or you just really believe they're just lying?
Well, I think it's possible, but again, if you take a look at recent track record, for example, they'll say things like, "We don't have access to any bodies," and then within 24 hours, they'll produce one, two, even three more bodies. So it certainly is possible that an unknown number of the hostage bodies that they are trying to recover are going to be very difficult to recover, either because of a building collapse or because the terrorists holding them were killed at some point during the conflict. That is a very real possibility. What I'm saying is that even if that is a real possibility we need to take into consideration, Hamas has clearly exaggerated the problem up until this point, given that whenever there is pressure applied to Hamas to produce more of the hostage bodies, they do so fairly quickly, faster than they claim that they're able to. So we have a bit of a gray area here where, yes, it's possible this process is going to take some time, but also Hamas is clearly exaggerating the problem. So you need to keep pressure on Hamas to be working as fast as they can.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what they have been doing, Hamas. A lot of us thought, I mean, maybe not me particularly, but people maybe thought after this, Hamas was going to disappear. They were done. They agreed to this deal, which includes their disarmament and for them to not be part of the main governing body of Gaza. However, we've seen them going out. I will say in kind of pity looking, like there was a photo of like 20 guys, like three of them had uniforms, two of them had guns, like, but still they're able to do violence and to persecute their own people. So tell us about what Hamas has been doing in Gaza.
Well, I think we should clarify that while the Trump plan requires Hamas to disarm and eventually be replaced by a technocratic committee first, and then eventually something like the Palestinian Authority, perhaps, Hamas never actually agreed to that. They sort of agreed to phase one of the Trump plan and included in their notice of agreement to that there were several caveats or yes but answers to the details of phase two, which is where you find the language about their disarmament and replacement. So from the beginning, the Trump administration has always sort of known that Hamas was going to fight the details on phase two, that they were going to try to resist implementation of phase two, even if they agreed to phase one. And that is exactly what's happening right now, is they are trying to avoid the implementation of phase two, which includes their disarmament and the replacement in Gaza. Now, I want to take a step back and make a note that is, I think, important. If you are familiar with the history of Hamas and its role in the Gaza Strip, it has not always been, and in fact, it's a relatively small amount of its history that Hamas has been interested in governance of Gaza. That's not really its primary objective, to govern or rule over the Gaza Strip. That more or less is a means to an end. If you think about why governing Gaza matters to Hamas, their concern is that it does not fall back into Israel's hands. Ideologically speaking, that would be a disaster because it's transfer of Muslim land to the infidels once again. But in more pragmatic political terms, the reason why Hamas cares so much about potentially being replaced in the Gaza Strip is because that would imply or suggest that a different power was going to arrive in Gaza. It was going to want to have a monopoly on power and try to remove Hamas's weapons from their control or their possession. Those weapons are key to the identity of Hamas. The reason why it exists at its core is its name means the Islamic Resistance Movement. If it does not have any weapons with which to resist Israel, it doesn't have any reason to exist or any legitimate cause to throw itself behind. So that's why Hamas cares so much about the weapons, the threats to disarm it, why it cares so much about remaining in control of Gaza. It never really cared that much about Gaza. If it did, obviously they would have spent a lot of money building things like schools and hospitals and not wasting it on the massive tunnel network that they built, for example, prior to October 7. But their control of Gaza is a means to an end that allows them to preserve their weapons and their ability to engage in the fight against Israel or terrorism, really. So that's what's at stake for Hamas right now and what they're trying to fight for. I think it's interesting if you listen to some of the statements that they're making about where they see the deal right now. They're going to challenge the portrayal that's being put out there by the Trump administration or other mediators and say that this is not a permanent ceasefire. This is a hudna, which basically is a term within Islamic jurisprudence that refers to the idea of a ceasefire, perhaps even a long term. You see Hamas officials giving interviews saying that they would like to have a 2 to 3 year ceasefire right now. But it's just that. It's not a cessation of the conflict. It's not an end to the conflict. It's a temporary pause in the conflict with the explicit goal stated of returning to the conflict at a later date after having time to, sort of reorganize, rearm, and prepare for the next round of conflict. So Hamas, its conception of what's happening right now is not that it's going to participate in the reconstruction of Gaza and a post-war plan for Gaza that creates a lasting peace, but rather it's just trying to buy time for the next round of conflict to prepare itself for the next round of conflict. And it's stating so publicly. You can hear this direct from the mouths of Hamas officials in their interviews. Now, in the process, what they have to do then is gain control of as much territory in the Gaza Strip as possible and prevent any opponents that would threaten their control of Gaza, but not just their effective control of Gaza, but also their monopoly on violence. So you do see random cases where they are targeting IDF soldiers. I think those cases are more random than a clear pattern at this point. It doesn't seem like they're interested in launching another full-scale war against Israel at this point, but sort of testing the boundaries of the current agreement and withdrawal lines, which will actually show a map here. I think that would be helpful. So this is effectively the withdrawal line. The yellow line is referred to. Israel's on the eastern side of this line, and Hamas is on the western side of this line. What they're trying to do is sort of test the boundaries of that and also make sure that they consolidate as much control as they can over the territory on the western side of this line. Most of the extreme violations of the agreements up until this point are actually directed towards Palestinian civilians. And what Hamas is doing right now is putting guys like this out on the street, men in black or even some police uniforms carrying these weapons, and they're targeting Palestinians, actually, in most cases, more so than they are IDF soldiers right now, ironically. And what they're doing basically is trying to target and get under control a number of their domestic political opponents who fall into a few different categories. You've got people who are part of criminal organizations or gangs. That is a real element to what's happening in the Gaza Strip, both now and for the last 2 years since October 7. So there is a certain degree to which there is a law and order problem that Hamas is trying to deal with in Gaza right now. But it's more than that. What they're also doing is trying to attack different centers of power, like local clans, for example, who predate Hamas, predate modern Gaza. They've been there since before 1948 and 49, when many Palestinian refugees were settled in the Gaza Strip area. So you have these very old families in the Gaza Strip who represent traditional centers of power that pose a threat to organizations like Hamas, and they've been trying to deal with those threats as well. You have cases in which they've accused people of collaborating with Israel, many of them falsely accused of collaborating with Israel. So these clans, in many cases, or members of these clans, or even people released from Israeli prisons that Hamas accuses of collaborating with Israel, there's no evidence for that. They strongly deny that. Israel denies that. There's no link between some of these organizations and people in Israel. But Hamas uses these accusations of collaboration with Israel as a pretext to attack them and try to weaken their influence or power in the Gaza Strip, to confiscate their weapons, confiscate their properties, even to confiscate hospital buildings that are being used as refugee housing areas or centers for their own purposes again. So all of the old tricks that Hamas has been up to for the last couple of years, they're still up to those old tricks. The difference is that now their target is Palestinian civilians and not the IDF, which is, I think, just a horrible tragedy. And if you look at what specifically they're doing, there are reports of torture, there are reports of mass executions taking place out on the street or even inside some hospitals. You take a few people, you interrogate them, torture them, and eventually kill them. And it's just a number of crimes that Hamas is committing right now that are really horrific to describe and are a little bit flying under the radar, I think, because people are just so happy that the hostages are back and that the deal's underway that there's a temptation to sort of look the other way. Sure, Hamas is going to do what they're going to do, but we'll eventually get the problem under control, right? And right now, it's a problem that threatens to spiral out of control very quickly if Hamas is not brought back into alignment with the agreement very quickly.
Yeah, I want to say two things. One, I think we should call out the people who have been calling for a ceasefire around the world. I think even the deal for the hostages were freed last Monday, and Sunday before that, there were thousands of people still protesting around Europe. I think in Barcelona, there were like 30,000 people protesting one day on Sunday before the hostages were released. So people have been calling for a ceasefire. And where's that crowd now? This is what they've been wanting. They've been wanting for Israel to stop its war against Hamas. And now that Israel has done that, they won't say anything about Hamas killing its own people. Where is Greta Thunberg? She went there. She went twice trying to bring aid to Palestinians. Didn't help a single Palestinian. They didn't improve the life of a single Palestinian. She was received back in Italy or Greece or something like that like a hero, but she has done nothing to improve Palestinian lives. And here they are. I actually saw some of these videos of the executions and they're terrifying. I would encourage you guys to see a video by a pro-Israel influencer. Her name is Montana Tucker. She went around a campus, I think it was UCLA, showing people this video like with kafia saying, do you support Palestine? Yeah, okay. Would you support our petition against Hamas killing its own people? And the people saw that and they're like, I'm not comfortable, and walked away. Because it's not really about, I think a lot of these people don't care about Palestinian lives. They just care about hating on Israel and spreading anti-Semitism. So that's one thing. The second thing, I think this highlights that one of the big challenges of this deal is that, and I think Israel did the right thing. The hostages are home. We can deal with every other problem going forward. The hostages are home, and that's the most important thing. It's the fact that it would have been ideal for the stabilization force to move in as the hostages were released, so that there would not be a vacuum in power, and then Hamas is back again in power. And now to get rid of them, you're gonna have to do something about it. So Josiah, what we didn't get to talk about last Monday, as the hostages were being freed, Trump gave a speech in the Knesset, and then he went to Egypt to meet with all these leaders that helped him do it, including Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar. Now, Qatar, Turkey have very different interests than Egypt or Saudi Arabia, for instance. So, by the way, I think this is really impressive that Trump was able to get these people together. Just to go over briefly, the leader of Egypt is in power because he got rid of the Muslim Brotherhood. The leader of Qatar is the main sponsor of the Muslim Brotherhood. And they too don't seem eye to eye. But here they were, because Trump brought them together. And then there is Turkey, Erdogan. So let's talk about the different interests. What is a risk here? Hamas seems to still be in power. Hamas still seems to be able to affect violence upon its people. What are the consequences of Hamas still being a player here?
Yeah, well, I think I just want to comment on something that you just said moments ago, Sebastian, about how it would have been ideal if the International Stabilization Force could go in at the same time the hostages were being released. My only thought as it relates to that is that, besides the fact that, yes, it would have been ideal, is that Hamas never would have agreed to that. The hostages would not have been released if one of the conditions was that the International Stabilization Force immediately enter, because Hamas has been trying to figure out how to game the system, game this agreement for its own benefit so that it maintains some power in the Gaza Strip. Now, in terms of the consequences of Hamas playing that game and refusing to go away, essentially, I think there are several that are pretty significant consequences we'll have to wrestle with over the next few months, probably even a couple few years. For example, I mean, you've already alluded to this, the amount of influence that is shared between moderate and let's call them more extreme leaders in the region. Egypt and Saudi Arabia, for example, are a little bit more on the moderate end of the spectrum. Qatar and Turkey, a little bit more on the Islamist side of the spectrum right now. And Hamas, the game that they're playing right now is putting the more moderate leaders in a position where they don't want to commit to participation in the reconstruction plan. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Saudi Arabia is a country with a massive amount of wealth that could be devoted to the project of rebuilding Gaza, redeveloping it, and creating a new system of governance. But if Hamas is not going to commit to staying out of the way, then the Saudis don't want to participate because it's reasonably likely, reasonable assumption that in a few years there will be another war between Hamas and Israel, and a lot of the money that the Saudis had pumped into Gaza would be lost because there would be more destruction, more violence in the Gaza Strip. So I understand the Saudi perspective. It's a fairly rational perspective that why would we commit money to a project that seems destined to fail if Hamas is going to be a part of it? The consequence, the unlikely, or not unlikely, the unfortunate reality is that that creates more space for the more extreme leaders in the region, like the Qataris or the Turkish government under Erdogan, to play an even bigger role in Gaza. And they're less likely to be putting pressure on Hamas or trying to push for necessary reforms in the Gaza Strip. So the deal as a whole, I'd say the Trump plan is less likely to succeed unless the Trump administration can bring in some of those more moderate leaders from the region. But in order to do that, they've got to figure out a way first to get Hamas to get out of the picture, is kind of what it seems like right now. And that's a big puzzle for everyone to try and solve. The other consequence that looks increasingly likely, I've heard this said by various analysts who are both Israeli and Palestinian, also some American officials, alluding to this idea that if things don't improve, if Hamas does not agree to leave the, let's call it 47% of the Gaza Strip that they currently control on the west side of that yellow line. And what you're going to see, and I'll put the map up here again for our viewers on YouTube, is basically a split in Gaza. You're going to see that what basically happens is on the eastern side of that yellow line, the 53% the IDF currently controls, the Trump plan basically calls for reconstruction to start there, even if it doesn't happen in the Hamas-controlled areas, because it can't until Hamas leaves. So you'll have about half of the Gaza Strip reconstructed, redeveloped, this international stabilization force moving in, this sort of technocratic committee, and this peace committee overseen by President Trump as the chairman of this committee, basically taking over in, let's call it, East Gaza. But in West Gaza, the part on the west side of that yellow line, Hamas is still going to be in power. And you're going to have a situation that the best analogies that I've heard are things like East-West Germany or East and West Berlin, or North and South Korea. You're going to have some sort of demilitarized zone, and you're going to have two very entrenched sides on either side of this line that are going to refuse to go anywhere. Now, that doesn't necessarily sound like the end of the world in the sense that Hamas is pushed farther back from the border of Gaza with Israel. It poses less of a threat to Israel in that situation, in theory at least. And you also have at least some Palestinians able to enjoy the benefits of reconstruction or redevelopment. One of the big challenges, though, I think that comes with this scenario, a couple of big challenges, but one of them is that the majority of Gazans still live on the west side of that line under Hamas control. Most of the major population centers are either divided between East and West Gaza, or Gaza City is almost exclusively inside West Gaza, which is under Hamas control. So that would be devastating, because you can imagine there's going to be hardly any effort made by the international community to reconstruct or redevelop the portion of Gaza controlled by Hamas. That means the majority of Palestinians are going to continue to live in an area that has been devastated, are going to continue to be reliant on international humanitarian aid, because there's going to be very little to no economic development. And it's just a horrible, horrible situation for Palestinians to have to live under if this split in Gaza is what ends up happening because Hamas refuses to leave. I think even though, I also want to make this point that even though it doesn't seem like the end of the world right now, sort of box in Hamas in West Gaza and wall it off from East Gaza and from Israel, there are short-term benefits, but long-term, this is not good, because It's going to create even more potential for radicalization of the Palestinians who are still under Hamas rule and are going to get increasingly desperate. It's also going to allow Hamas some time, even if they are boxed in, to prepare for the next round of conflict. And 2 to 3 years from now, this is going to once again be a major security threat to Israel and to the rest of the Middle East. It's a short term, not a long term or permanent solution to the Hamas problem to box them in this way. And I think we have to be very realistic about that, what that actually means.
Well, Josiah, I think, like we said before, the most important thing is the hostages are home. It's just so joyful to see them being reunited with their families. We understand, I think President Trump understands very well the pain of the families who are still wanting to get the remains of their loved ones. And he's been very adamant about it. He's mentioned it a lot. Clearly, the hostage families have gotten to him and he listens to them. So we are going to continue to track this. The hostages are home, but the next thing that we need to be hoping for and praying for is that Hamas will not be able to do this ever again. So with that in mind, let us talk about how should Christians respond to this situation. Palestinians in Gaza are still suffering. So how do you think we should respond to this? And then we'll talk about some prayer points.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that I would encourage Christians to think about when we think about responding and before we respond to the current situation. The first is that we should try to imagine what does it look like to be compassionate and continue speaking with moral clarity. It's been very important, I think, to us at Passages and to other Christian supporters of Israel that we are compassionate and speaking with moral clarity. And to this point, a lot of the focus has been on showing compassion for the victims of the war on both sides, but also speaking with moral clarity about how bad Hamas truly is and the fact that Hamas is responsible for much of the pain and suffering of the last 2 years. To your point, Sebastian, people do seem to be sort of supporters of the Palestinian cause, seem to be sort of glossing over that fact right now. They were advocating for a ceasefire. Now that we have one, they're not necessarily calling out Hamas for the bad things that it's doing. I would say that's a problem that does exist, unfortunately, on both sides of the aisle. I've also seen some Christian supporters of Israel who have basically argued, great, the war is over now. Hamas can't hurt Israel anymore. And, we can quibble with that fact because eventually that won't be true. But for now, they can't hurt Israel, so it's time to move on, right? And my answer would be not quite yet. I don't think that is really the most morally consistent and intellectually honest approach to be taking right now because Hamas is still bad. And unfortunately, the reality is that their victims are now Palestinians, but they are still victims of Hamas who deserve our compassion and the moral clarity and courage to speak out and say that Hamas is still bad and its victims still deserve our attention. The second response I think that we need to bring to the table is a sense of pragmatism. It doesn't do anyone any good to pretend like Hamas is just going to go away willingly. They're not. They've made that very clear, and that's never been the way that they operate, even in previous wars or cycles of violence. So we have to be realistic about that. At the same time, this is a very big challenge, but I think it's overly optimistic to say all we have to do is say no to Hamas, get them out of the picture, and then things will be better. That's not a realistic assessment of the situation either. And that reflects, I think, a sense of overeager optimism because in order to effectively replace Hamas, you can't just say no to Hamas. You have to offer a positive alternative, something that can actually replace Hamas so that it gives people some hope. And that is a bigger burden to assume and a bigger task. But if we're thinking about this in pragmatic, practical terms, we have to be willing to accept that the task really is that big. It's not just as easy as and as simple as saying Hamas go away. The last thing that I'll note is that Christians, I think, need to think in terms of responsibility. For the last 2 years, we've been very inspired by our community's support for different causes like the return of the hostages and things like that. And it would be understandable if people are exhausted. I mean, I'm just going to be honest. Personally, I am exhausted after 2 years of war post October 7. But I don't think we should grow tired of advocating for the triumph of good versus evil because evil still exists in the world. There is still more good that can be brought to bear. And I think as Christians, if we considered ourselves responsible for the last 2 years to advocate for good versus evil, then we should assume that that responsibility still exists. And we should not grow tired, but continue to lean into that responsibility to be a light in darkness because there are still some pretty dark things happening that need to be confronted. So those are my thoughts. Sebastian, would be curious to hear any pushback you have or anything you want to add on.
No, I love that thought. I love the theme on which you ended. One of the things that we've talked about during this war that's been now that had gone now for 2 years, and Josiah, I think the war's not over. I think there's a ceasefire now, but the war is still going on. And so let's talk about some of the fronts. The front with Iran is quiet. The front with Lebanon is quiet. But I think one of the fronts of this war continues, and it's the war on the narrative or the truth of this war on college campuses, in social discourse, and even at your local church. So, Christian, I think one of the things we should pray about is that we will be people who stand up for truth, who contribute facts to this conversation. What I'm anticipating on campuses in the next few months, it's the battle for the narrative to be fought out. I think we're going to have people arguing that Israel committed genocide, and I think it will be important for us to speak on facts, receive battle assessments from credible sources. And I think we need to pray that the war against Israel in the United States will die down, will quiet down, because truly it has been horrific to see the levels of anti-Semitism, which takes me into a second thing. One thing that I'm very much worried about is the continued rise of seemingly Christian anti-Semitism, quote unquote Christian anti-Semitism. I don't know how Christian some of these people are, but there's a lot of conservative people on the right who are turning against Israel, who are very evil in the comments, saying really nasty things. And here I want to speak about one thing. Vance is in Israel right now. And I think this is purely about politics. I think it's because, Marco Rubio looks really great, Kushner and Witkoff looks really great. And because I think Trump owes it to J.D. Vance to help him prop him up to become the next president of the United States. He's let him go and kind of take a victory lap and seem like he's part of this. But we all know Vance is very non-interventionist. He doesn't want to be involved abroad in things like this. And also, he's close to really nasty, like scary people like Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson's son works for J.D. Vance, and Carlson and Vance are pretty close. And I will say, we didn't talk about this, but even at the funeral of Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson said some really, really horrific thing. He kind of went in to say that these Jews who met in Jerusalem tried to kill Jesus. So he was trying to play along this anti-Semitic conspiracy that Israel was behind the murder of Kirk. So I digress. What I'm trying to highlight is that the fight against anti-Semitism is still going on, and it's up to us Christians to stand up for it. So we pray that our churches will stand up to it, that our fellows will stand up to it, that you as our alumni will join us to combat anti-Semitism, whatever you are. And finally, for the land, Josiah, I'm going to be preaching from Jeremiah at my church soon. And as I was reading the whole book, it stood out to me how God repeats many times, like, how much he cares about this land. He says, I will not allow you to live in my land because of how you're behaving. So he kicks them out, and then he allows them to return to his land. The land belongs to the Lord. So this concept, stay with me, people. What I want to highlight is that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So the Lord still cares about this land. It is the holy land, is what the Bible calls it. Is the land that was set apart, the holy land. And I think we should appeal to the Lord, pray to him that he will wipe out this evil of Hamas, who are doing iniquity in his land, in the holy land, the land that's been set apart. They're defiling it, they're shedding blood, and they're oppressing the poor, the widow, the orphan. And I think we should appeal to the Lord that for the peace of the region, for the safety of the Jewish people, that Hamas will be dealt with and they'll be gone. It is not an impossibility. I think they should be gone, and that could be possible. So those are my prayer points against anti-Semitism, for people to stand up against the narrative that will be rising, and for the Lord to remove this evil from his land. That's my prayer point, Josiah. Any last words?
I love that. I love that. The prayer point specifically that God would remove evil from his land and that he would bring peace. I think the promises within scripture that the Lord is not just a God who hates evil, but also loves to provide peace and abundance and flourishing. And I think that's ultimately what we pray for everyone who's been impacted over the last 2 years, the Israelis and Palestinians both, who have been victimized by Hamas, that not only would Hamas be removed in God's providence, but also that they would know the abundance and flourishing of God's provision. So I hope so. And we'll be praying for that.
Man. All right, y'all. We'll be tracking the developments in the land and we'll be here next week. Thank you for watching today. We want to thank our producer, Lindsay. Thank you for helping us out. And we'll see you next time in the Passages Pulse. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.